Hi there, this is Carl Irwin, and this is going to be a somewhat unique tutorial. You'll find that whenever you're looking online at music instruction, music tutorials, it's usually going to be categorized by topic. This is going to be quite the opposite. This is going to be a discussion and essentially a tutorial on general composition. General composition. How do you approach writing music from the very beginning? What does composing from inception of concept look like, and how do you approach that? There is a lot of discussion out there among composers about where particular people start, whether they're starting from template, whether they're using particular kinds of software, if they're working from a particular software or hardware environment. But I mean hardware, like are they using pencil and paper and sitting at an acoustic instrument or a piano or something like that? A lot of different perspectives on this, and they can sort of appear as if there's competing views. This tutorial, this discussion, is really going to try very hard to dispel all of that, as you'll see as we go on. So there's going to be a lot of talk here, and then we'll just try to design something, just a couple of ideas for you, just to see how one could, a particular track that one could take among many tracks, and also to help you to be aware, regardless of where you're coming at this from. If you are an amateur in the truest sense, you do it because you love it, you're a hobbyist, right? It doesn't matter who you are. This is really just going to be for everybody. And I think we'll hopefully find that we're all really in the same place, very much in the same place, much more than you might think. Okay, so that's the topic, general composition. Let's get into it. You might want to have a cup of coffee for this one. You might want to have something kind of nearby, because there's going to be a lot of talk here. I'm much more interested in hashing out theory and concepts more than just giving you a quick trick. I don't believe in quick tricks. I think when you are looking at composition tutorials and they are posed as a trick, there's no tricks to composing. You're just merely focusing in on a vocabulary issue among many vocabulary issues. That is not a trick. It's just what there is. It's merely vocabulary. It is composition, but composition within a particular type of vocabulary from which you're starting. So let's get rid of that word trick. None of what we're going to be doing is a trick. None of what you see is a trick. No such thing. Okay? All right, let's look here. Environment. The number one thing that you need to know about environment is that all discussions on environment are pretty irrelevant. It doesn't matter what environment you're working in. You could be working in a digital audio workstation. You could be working directly to notation, as you can see we'll be doing here probably. You could be working pencil and paper. It is totally irrelevant. Music cares not for environment. Music is a concept that is linguistic, right? The environment that you're in really doesn't affect the music, and the music doesn't affect the environment. You just work in the environment you're comfortable with. That's really the point, right? And by the way, as you're looking at various discussions and tutorials online about music composition, or even from your schooling, all of the stuff that you see out there, all of the discussions out there really can apply to any and all environments. It does not matter. The issue about environment, the discussions and arguments surrounding environment are absolutely irrelevant. Now, there is a perception out there, a dogmatic one that some people hold to, that using technology, a technological environment in order to do composition allows people with lesser skill sets to be more efficient and more productive. My response to that is, duh, you think? Really? You think so? I mean, that's kind of the point, right? Now, the assumption I think that can piggyback on that, which I think is where the real erroneous ideas come from, is that because something makes the process more efficient, it means that people who are actually who have less creative genius can accomplish more without the genius, right? I think the idea there is that people that work from pencil and paper from their mind or at a piano really rely more on creative genius than other people. And that is a lie. Prove it. If you're going to make that claim, you actually have to, at a philosophical level, you have to explain why that is true. And you can't merely just say that a person with electronic reference is getting help, because a person without electronic reference still has reference no matter how you look at it. It might be from a piano, it might be from an internalized vocabulary that comes from an externalized experience. But either way you look at it, everybody's getting the same reference. Reference is what you need, and you're getting that reference one way or the other. You've heard it in other people, you've studied it from score, you've heard it orally, right? Or you've seen it and heard it, or you've played it yourself. In terms of immediate reference, you're playing on an instrument, or you're referring to in your mind the reference of having heard instrumentation performing in that vocabulary. Or if you're working in technology, your piano has now become the digital interface, right? The playback engine. It's all the same. Burdens on you people out there claiming that genius sits at some other kind of level. Okay, so there is also some historical legend about particular composers. You know, the idea that Mozart would write music faster than people could play it, right? He would write it out and they would pass the parts along and people could play it. This is just a bunch of nonsense and baloney. How do I know this? Well, we have the sketches. I mean, we have them. We have sketches of him, of his work, incomplete ideas in sketch form, and those sketches have things crossed out on them. We're getting into the weeds now in terms of philosophy, but environment doesn't matter, it's irrelevant. I've made my case, go ahead and make yours if you disagree. Sketch environment. This is not necessarily about your software environment. That's the previous discussion. Your sketch environment has to do with what you're going to be working off of in terms of voices, right? You can do a condensed kind of environment, or you can do a complete environment, right? In fact, this is probably mismarked down here. It should look like this, because this is a different, a completely different category. You either have a condensed environment, or you have a direct to full score environment. So condensed, these are just some of the ideas, some of the I think mediums that you can work in, and it's not exhaustive. You can probably think of more. A lot of people work off of a condensed piano, just a grand staff, right? Treble clef, bass clef. Some people work off of multiple grand staffs, multiple piano sounds. You might just have piano patches in your software, or you're working directly from piano scores, pencil to paper. You have multiple grand staffs for different voice parts, right? Another one would be, this is very popular, probably one of the most popular ways to work is this way, in terms of sketching. I recommend, if you're working on software, or if you're sitting down at an instrument, if you can sit down at a synthesizer or an organ that has sustained sound, I think that can be a little bit better conceptually, because you can sustain sound. When working from piano patches or piano voices in a digital audio workstation, I think you lack the ability to have sustained sound that can really give you a complete concept of harmonics and the interplay of harmonics, whereas using an organ or a synth sound can help with that. So that's another idea, very much related. I like to work often with strings. Whether or not I'm going to eventually be writing in strings for the final doesn't matter, but writing in strings gives you a family of like sounds that can play short notes, different articulations, long sustained sounds, and I can get a really, really good concept of what I'm writing, just writing in a string orchestra kind of environment. Maybe 3 strings or the full 5-string complement. And then you can have also sections or condensed score. So you might have a condensed score where you have maybe high, mid, low voices and various instrumentation, or you might have in a digital audio workstation or on notation, maybe a grand staff for woodwinds, grand staff for brass with associated patches loaded in or voices loaded in, and then maybe a grand staff for strings, and then maybe you have a couple of staves for just general percussion. I tend to save percussion for the end. If you're writing in percussion, you might do any one of these things for the tonal percussion and then have various staves on there for specific drum type instruments that you might expand out later on as you get into the piece, right? So these are options: condensed, or you can write full to score. A lot of options there. And I think it's incorrect to say that one is better, or that you necessarily have to pick one or stick with one. I think given your creative juices, you might find that any one of these are a better place to start. For me, what do? I do all of them. I do all of them at different times. It depends on what the environment is that I'm going to end up in and where my brain is thinking at the very beginning, right? Whatever the creative juices are, wherever they're flowing, is going to dictate kind of what my sketch environment is going to look like. I think if I was going to say that I favor one over the other, I tend to write in strings, or I tend to write in organ. So one of these two kind of in the middle is tend to where I sketch out. Next topic here is initial concept. Initial concept. So this is probably the one that people think about the most when they think about where do composers start. A lot of composers will get this question. Do you start with a melody? Do you start with a chord progression? Harmonic. Melodic versus harmonic, right? One or the other. I think there's other options. I think this is a false dichotomy. I think you can actually go into other areas that kind of incorporate both concepts. I tend to think more motivically in terms of short bursts of melody, but those short bursts of melody might have a harmonic quality to them in terms of maybe just intervals or two chords phasing one to the next. And then from there, I work in transposition of that motivic concept, right? If I'm not bound to traditional harmony, a traditional progression of chords, I will often think very motivically. If I am bound to traditional progressions, I will tend to think more harmonically. If I'm thinking about a theme in mind, then certainly I start melodically and then I work towards a harmonic realization of that melody. Okay, so any one of these is fair game. Traditional versus exotic, okay, because this can apply to all of these. You might be working in a traditional tonality, meaning that you're working in a major or minor key signature, but you might be thinking more exotic, some other kind of exotic scale, which will then dictate the harmonic progression that you're dealing with. On top of these, there's other things I haven't written down. You might be thinking in terms of repetition or ostinato patterns. I find that ostinato patterns are extremely overused. If you're trying to be new and innovative, don't start with an ostinato pattern. Everybody's been doing it for decades. It is getting old. It's getting tired. That's my opinion. I think it may be more unique for you to start from a more melodic, harmonic, or motivic standpoint rather than a drone sound or a repeating ostinato. Am I against those things? Not at all. I think those are very limited devices. I think they ought to be used in limitation. I think they can be used at moments to help drive a moment. But so much music is just built on this stuff as a foundation, and I think they make for very poor and tired foundations, particularly in film music. I highly recommend that you go for one of these other things to be a little bit more unique in your sound. I think there's different ways to compose in a vacuum. You can compose in a vacuum that's meant to imply that you're composing only for what you like. But I think that by hearing other people doing something that you have latched onto, you can compose in that vacuum. That is someone else's vacuum, right? I think there needs to be a balance. You should be composing music that you like. You must be doing that. I think that is essential. But I think you also need to be thinking about the audience, and you need to be thinking about what is going to appeal to a broad spectrum of listeners. What will captivate people? Obviously, I would hope we want to be writing music that people want to listen to. And in doing so, I think you have to be very careful about just writing in one kind of type. Try to be more unique. And I think you're going to find that thinking melodically, harmonically, and motivically, rather than thinking about repeating patterns. Okay. formal structure. So formal structure, this has to do with what is the overall form of your piece. Formal or through composed. This means that you have an A section, A, B, A, B, A, A, B, C, A, in terms of pop music, right? Verse, or rather chorus, verse, verse, chorus, verse, bridge, chorus, fade, whatever your form is. It doesn't matter, okay? Are you going to be thinking formally in that way, or are you going to be thinking through composed? Through composed is more like, I don't know, the impressionist, expressionist kinds of periods of music writing where there was not a form. You didn't really necessarily have an A section that would repeat. You might have repeating ideas or concepts, but it's really a small concept that comes out, and then there is just constant development, right, that goes on. Development down here can be a part of formal structure, but it is really a moment in classical literature in particular, we have development, where you have a section that's all been laid out, maybe ABA, and then those ideas are then developed in sequence in various different kinds of devices through a moment, and then you come out of that development and then kind of repeat your established formal sections again, right? Sections, themes, or development. What do you start with, right? So formal or through composed. Sections, themes, or development. What are you doing? What are you starting with? Where's the beginning point? Chicken or egg? I think that's really where this is. Chicken or egg, right? I don't think it matters. I don't think it matters where you start. Again, you need to follow the creative juices. What are you thinking about? Develop the thing you're thinking about. Do not pigeonhole yourself into a construct because you think it is right. Do write down whatever you're thinking of. If you have a melody but you don't have necessarily a harmonic progression realized for it, make sure you write down the melody. If you still don't have a concept for the harmonic progression, write down a counter melody or a bass line, right? Realize the stuff in between. If you can't necessarily come up with functional harmony in between, then don't write any functional harmony. Realize out just some other kind of harmonic sequence. You don't have to necessarily be functional in it. It could be a series of intervals that interplay together, or just a quality of harmony that is not necessarily traditional or functional. That's okay. Right? Follow whatever it is you're doing, piece by piece, building block by building block, and then work out from there. If you find that you've done something that has a developmental quality to it, and inside there you have maybe a melody that you could develop further into sections or themes, then go ahead and precede that material and create your sections, A, B, C, A, B, A, whatever. Okay? And then you have your development material, and then you work kind of from the inside out. I think it is most important, though, to consider this. The final perception for the listener will be start to finish. Develop any way that you want, but when you get to the final polish and the final sequence, whether it is formal or through composed, you do want to pay special attention to the concept of inevitability and intentionality. It needs to sound like you're doing everything on purpose and that it is meant to be this way. And those are concepts that you should consider in your final output. All right? Just my opinion. So much about approach doesn't matter. To sum this up, so much about your approach really doesn't matter, right? The present source of creativity, what is that? Whatever that is, that's where that will dictate your approach. What are you thinking about right now? Are you thinking of a chord progression? Then you start with the chord progression. Don't think, well, my favorite composer doesn't do that. They start with melodies and I'm so bad at writing melodies. Why does that matter? Start with a chord progression, develop a melody from that. Develop your melodic material from that. You don't have to start with a melody. It's not right necessarily to do that, okay? Wherever you're thinking is right. Wherever you're thinking is right, okay? The final product matters. That's really what matters. How you get there doesn't matter. Not to me, not to anybody else. That only matters to you. Whatever makes sense to you in the moment is what you should do. The end justifies the means by which you get to the end. Okay? So that's that. Let's take a look at writing some music here. So I've got a 5 staves out here, a string complement. We don't necessarily have to use all of it, but this is just the way I'm going to think. You don't have to do this. You can do whatever you want. If you want to write into full score, go right ahead and do that if that's how you're conceiving of it. A lot of people find that they can think, at least at a musical level, if they condense everything down, they're a little bit more quick and efficient and they can separate things out from there. But you don't have to do that. That's not necessarily the right way to do it. I would liken it to writing a paper, research paper or a report. There's a lot of ways that you can do that. The classic way to do that is to take note cards. You go into the library, the old school way. Now you do things online, right, with sources online that you can find in online libraries. And then you will write down your ideas on note cards and you organize those note cards into categories of thought. From that, you then write your paper in the in the final, or into at least an initial draft that will lead to the final draft, by going off of the organization of those note cards that are topical, right? From that, you develop your thesis, you develop your material that supports your thesis, you develop your conclusions based on the material on the thesis, and then you have your paper. That's what we're doing here. We're essentially sketching using a lower level or a deeper level of information from which we will branch out and then create our final polish. But you don't have to do that. You could just as easily write your paper direct to document topically by going to the beginning, to the end, to the middle, right? Copy and pasting, moving things around. That's the benefit of digital technology and software interface, right? That's the benefit of doing that, is that you don't have to paste together paper. You can do it direct to a document, right? That is figurative in digital space, right? That's the benefit. And it has nothing to do with capability. It has to do with the advances of technology. If I want to plow a field, I can do it, one of several ways. I can do it by hand, or I can do it with a machine, right? Either way, really, it's my knowledge of how properly to plow a field that matters most. It doesn't matter what tool I'm using to do it, right? I can be good at farming using any method. My knowledge of farming and the right way to work the earth, to manage the earth, regardless of the tools, that is the genius. And so it goes with music as well. Okay. All right. Let's take a look here. Let's write something. So what do I want to do? I don't know. My creative juices right now are thinking not necessarily harmonically or melodically or motivically. I'm thinking exotically. I'm just going to use a whole tone scale. Why don't we just go with that? Okay. Now, from a whole tone scale, I can think chordally in terms of harmonic progression, but I can also think melodically. I'm not really thinking of a melody in particular right now. So I'm just going to go down to the violin 2 section right here, start on measure number 2. I'm just going to put together some chords that are built on the whole tone scale, right? So we'll do this based on C. Now, the whole tone scale, it can be transposed, right? There's only 2 transpositions of the whole tone scale. I can either start, it doesn't matter what note I start on. We'll just go with C natural, right? I could start on C, or I could start on C sharp. And I will get both variations of it because we're just working in whole steps, right? There's only one transposition. Now, this can imply a vast array of tonality because I could try to imply a tonal center by bringing in traditional functional harmony at certain moments to create cadence points, right? And I can kind of lean back on my understanding of traditional harmony to use this a whole tone sort of structure to create content, but then to imply a vast array of tonal centers by bringing in traditional harmony, if that makes sense. I can switch back and forth anytime I want to. I think one of the better ways to write is not necessarily, and this is very contemporary, I think particularly if you look at film music. Take someone like John Williams, for example. When you look at John Williams, a lot of other film composers and contemporary composers that are very eclectic, they draw on a vast array of styles and eras. I think you don't necessarily think of a key anymore when you're writing modern music. I think you think of a universe. Rather than the key of C major, I think you can think of the universe of C, which can be a wide variety of modalities. The idea is that we're just using our knowledge of functional harmony to tonicize C or E flat or F sharp or whatever the case may be. So I'm kind of thinking in that vein, and I'm thinking of the whole tone scale. So let me make a chord progression here, and I'm going to maybe come up with something that's going to tonicize C, even though we're using whole tone, a whole tone kind of format. I might bleed out of that and use some functional harmony, incorporate some chromaticisms to create a sort of cadence point, okay? So we have C. We would also need, now I could use chordal harmony if I want to. That is harmony that's based on a fourth or more chordal quintal harmony, or I can use triads, and I can freely move back and forth if I want to. Maybe I'll do that. Let's start with that. So we have C, E, and then the next note could be one of several. I could use F sharp actually, because it's far enough away, or I could use G flat because it'd be the same enharmonic note, or I could use G sharp. I could extend further. Maybe I'll do that. So you have kind of an augmented triad, open kind of sound. Maybe on my next chord, I could use one of those notes or two of those notes and just change one, or I could change them all. Let's work away from this. Maybe I'll change one note. I'm going to change the root note and move it down. And I'm going to go down to the next whole tone, which would be either a B flat or an A sharp. We'll just keep this consistent right now. We use A sharp. And I'm going to keep my E and my G sharp. Okay? So let's just listen back and see what this sounds like harmonically. Now I can move on from here. Maybe I will bring back my C. I'll keep my E present here, and then I'm going to move up now, or maybe I'll move down now to an F sharp. I'll close this down. Okay, so we're going to close down our spacing a little bit. Listen. Maybe on the next one, I'll keep my F sharp, my E. So I have E going all the way through this, and I'll come back down to my A sharp. Now that could be a loop, right? Now I said you want to avoid loops, but I have a 4-measure kind of loop going on here. This might be the sort of the progression. It almost sounds like it wants to come back to this measure over here. Let's just see if this works in sequence well enough. Right? It sounds like it wants to go back there. Now, another thing I could try is I could go into transposition now. Maybe I'll take this down a half step. Right? So if I move everything down a half step. Now, right now, we're just sketching, so we're not really worried about the interplay of accidentals. We can clean that up later so that we have kind of a more, an easier to read set of accidentals. We generally don't want to mix up sharps and flats too much, at least too regularly. So now we have a transposition of that same idea that's down a half step. Let's see what this sounds like. And then this could loop, and now I have an 8-measure harmonic sort of progression going on here, okay? Now, it doesn't matter what inversions I have this stuff in. I can move things around. It doesn't really matter. Now, I've not had a melody in mind. I've just had kind of a tonality in my mind, that whole tone scale kind of ethereal sort of sound, and that's what I've decided to start with. That's where my creative juices are at. Someone out there might be listening to this and thinking, well, that's junk. I always start with a melody. Good for you. That's nice, okay? But I'm telling you that if you ever are thinking of something other than a melody, write that down. Don't wait until a moment where you're thinking of a melody. This is a good way to get past the idea of composer's writer's block, right? A lot of people develop writer's block in terms of music composition, because they've pigeonholed themselves. They're saying, I like to write melodies and I can't think of a melody. I like to write harmonic progressions, chord progressions, but I just can't think of something I haven't done already, right? Well, you have two options. Do what you've done already. Start with that. Start with that. If it's stuck in your mind, write it down, right? Or you could just decide to use a different tactic. If you like to write melodies and you can't think of a melody, write down the harmonic progression that's in your mind. Do something else and then develop off of that. The last thing I want to say about this is don't please yourself 100%. Please yourself better than 50, right? Do things, write down. Sketching is for making things, writing things down that are good enough right now. They don't have to be absolutely satisfactory. They're good enough right now. I cannot tell you how many times I've written final pieces of music that were derived from material that was good enough right now. And ultimately, in the end, I come up with something that's absolutely satisfactory, okay? But I wouldn't get there if I just chose not to write down what was good enough right now. If I said, well, it's good enough right now, therefore it's not good enough. Write down what is good enough right now and then move on. Save that file, put it away, whether you're in a workstation or in notation or sketching on paper. It doesn't matter. If it's good enough right now, write it down. Okay? 50% or better. Don't get too picky. All right? Let's say this is good enough right now. I don't hear anything wonderful coming out of this, but it's good enough right now. Good enough right now. Okay? Let's maybe come up with some kind of melody. Now, in terms of writing melodies, I find that it is better, at least in my mind, to write melodies that have wider gaps in them. I think about people that write melodies well. I really don't like in musical theater right now, Disney music production, kind of the pop music influence. I don't like the idea that so much of what's going on is hip-hop influence, and you have very narrow melodies or just within a 5-note kind of pitch collection. They're very, very narrow. It's accessible for sure. I find that when you look at people like Alan Menken, right, or even kind of the old stuff, the Rodgers and Hammerstein, the old things, that kind of writing had large gaps. When you think about folk music, or even you think about like just well-known music within culture, happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you. You have large leaps, happy birthday, right? Big leaps, big jumps. Those are very identifiable marks. Think about meeting a person. If I meet someone new on the street and they say, hello, my name is Bob. If I'm smart, I'll shake Bob's hand, I'll look Bob in the face, and I'll think about Bob's features. And I might note, Bob's got kind of a big nose, right? Bob's nose is kind of big. Or Bob's ears stick out a little bit more than normal, right? Or maybe Bob's like me. He's got a deep receding hairline, right? The features that are very noticeable and exaggerated about Bob are what you attach to Bob's name that help you to remember Bob as a unique person, a unique individual. The more average a person looks, the harder it is to remember them by their face, right? Fortunately, we're all pretty unique when you get down to it. Your music should be like that. As you're coming up with melodies, make something that has uniqueness to it, exaggerated features. Let's use some wide intervals here. So let's go up here. And we don't necessarily have to use chord tones. Remember, we have a construct that we're working with that is tonal, and that is the whole tone scale. I could use any notes that are within that scale. Let's work from the beginning here. Big leaps. Let's go to, maybe we'll start on that C. We're going to try to imply a C tonicization. And I'm just going to put in a few quarter notes just so we have C. And the first jump I'm going to take is going to be up to the G sharp. Okay, so big leap up here. And then I'm going to make a big leap down. Maybe I'm going to go crazy. I'm going to go all the way down to this low E. And then I'm going to come back up to a G sharp. Yeah, let's go with that. Let's add some variation to the rhythm. I'm going to put a dot on there. Now, I have a G sharp in the next measure. I don't have to continue with a rapid movement. I can sustain on this note into the next measure. Maybe I'll do that. Okay, so I have a G sharp that continues. In fact, I'll tie this together. Right? Let's listen to that. In fact, I want to separate this a little bit more so that I can hear my melody clearly. I'm going to copy all this material, move it down into the violas, and I'm just going to drop it an octave. In fact, I think I have to actually, because I'm moving out of range here, I'll put it in the cello. And we'll just grab this material here and delete it. Let's listen to what we have. Now, I have very dark sounding, right, for right now. I've got this line. Maybe I want to repeat a similar kind of sequence. So what I'm going to do, because repetition and rhythm and changes in interval, at least in terms of a linear contour, is very good. It's very good, but they're not going to be the same notes. Repetition is good, but it doesn't have to be exact. I'm just going to copy and paste this over here. Even though the notes are different, let's see if we can contort these into compatible notes to what's going on. So I have my C again, right? But I'm not jumping up to a G sharp anymore. Now I'm going up to an F sharp. So I'm just going to bring this down to the F sharp. And I'm going to leave my E here. And I'm going to bring this to my F sharp. And fortunately, my F sharp is in both. Okay, so this kind of works out. So I've got a sequence here in my first four measures. Let me hear what it sounds like. Now, I know what I've done over here, right? What did I do? I took everything down a half step. I could grab all of this material. I could paste it over here, at least initially, and take it down my half step. And now I know I have something that is compatible with my progression down here, and I can listen to it all together. And you can see this works reasonably well, right? This is just a starting point. Other things that I could do, I could get rid of this entirely. I'm going to take the first two measures, and then I'm going to paste them down here, double duration. Then I'm going to take that, paste over here, and move it down a half step. And you can see what this interplay sounds like intervallically. You can kind of see how this works. So this is just the starting point for composition. Now there's a couple things I might want to contend with. For example, over here we have this continuing G sharp from the original first two measures, and now we are introducing an F sharp. So what I might do is remove the tie, and then I'll just take these notes, the sustain notes, and I'll move them, instead of the G sharp, I'll move them down to the F sharp. So I'll want to do the same thing over here as well. So we're going to move these notes down the full step to the lower note. And now we should have a little bit more of a compatibility between these two parts. Let's listen in. And it works because it's derivative, right? We're not really thinking harmonically necessarily, even though there is somewhat of a harmonic basis for all of this that comes from the original sort of progression of notes that we came up with. We can take this a step further yet and try to expand it out. Let's take the first measure, first two measures rather. We're going to go down to the cello. We'll copy that. We'll go to the cello and we're going to paste this at half duration. And we'll bring it down to the right register. In fact, I'm going to take the first two notes, we'll drop them an octave, so we're going to change the contour a little bit, And I might want to return this actually to an eighth note pattern rather than a dotted eighth and a 16th. So I'm going to take this note here and reduce it back to an eighth note. And then we'll add an eighth note here for that E. And we'll take this and we'll copy it. And then over here where we have a change, we can do the same kind of process. So we'll take the first two measures again here, measures 3 and 4, copy them, paste half duration, bring it down, and we'll also again adjust these for eighth notes. So again, this is derivative material. Now we know that the next four measures are actually the exact same thing, but down a step. That's how we designed it. So we'll copy those measures, paste them, bring them down a step. We want to go down a half step, not a whole step. Okay, I think we're all set now. Let's take a listen. Right? And I don't think you necessarily have a melody going on, but there is certainly some kind of a motivic contour with these intervals that are happening up here. We could take this even further. We'll take these notes, and I'm going to double them down in the bass. I'll take this measure, bring it down an octave, copy it and paste it. And we'll do it again for the next pair. And we know that the first four measures are just a repeat down a half step. So let's hear what we have here. We should have a doubling, octave doubling, and then the bass will continue for the second half of the measure. So the cello and bass are very similar, which is typical to this type of writing. Very interesting. So maybe the last thing to deal with is some kind of secondary line happening up here in the violin 2. We have a few options. We could try to duplicate something that's already happening. We could write a new part in there. That's also a possibility. Maybe what we'll do is we'll take the main line and we'll just use other notes, perhaps from the chords that we were using there, or maybe just from the scale. Again, we're kind of limited just to these few notes in the scale, in the whole tone scale. And we don't necessarily have to follow a chord progression because we're not really following a chord progression per se here. That's just what we derived our main melody from in the top line. So let's try a couple of options here. First, I'm going to take these notes and bring them down an octave to get them out of the way. And we'll just write for the first four measures and then we'll duplicate it for the next four. So let's see, we have C. Maybe what I'm going to do is remain on the C. And then here I'm going to remain on the E. And then here I'm going to remain on the C. And then again on the E. Okay, so we'll take this. We'll copy it, paste it, take it down a half step, and let's listen. So this whole track we've been taking is kind of interesting, right? We're not necessarily working with a melody. We're not necessarily working with a functional harmony. We are working with an exotic scale to start with, but ultimately we're making something derivative. We used a sort of progression, and we derived from that a sort of motivic line. And then from that, we duplicated it in rhythmic augmentation and in contraction to make these derivative parts. And because they're derivative, they're quite compatible with each other. And then you end up with sort of this very interesting counterpoint that is very compatible part to part. Now, another thing you can do is trade these parts off to different voices, changing octaves, and you can come up with a very interesting texture. So again, just to show you different ways to think about writing music in an experimental way. You can then transition from this into more functional harmony or into some other kind of melodic material. This is very developmental sounding, so this might be something that's kind of in a developmental section later on. And from this, you might pull out ideas that you could derive main melodies and more of a formal structure earlier in the piece that will lead into this. Again, you don't have to write in a particular order. So again, just some ideas for you to consider on the topic of general composition. Hopefully you enjoy this and it helps you if you ever get stuck or you ever have a sort of block and you don't know what to do. This is a different way maybe to look at music for you. So best of luck with this. Happy composing.